Hi, my name is Nancy. Welcome to another episode of Budget Podcast. In this episode, we'll be discussing Nigeria's Energy Transition Plan. Now, a few months ago, the federal government of Nigeria released the nation's Energy Transition Plan. Now, releasing this plan is one thing, achieving it is another. Now, since its release, our stakeholders are asking questions on how implementable and sustainable the plan actually is. Among other things, Nigeria's Energy Transition Plan will lift 100 million Nigerians out of poverty. It will also drive and manage economic growth and expected job loss within the sector. Well, on this episode, we'll be hearing from Tengi George Ikoli, a senior officer at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, NRGI, and we also have a colleague joining her from CISLAC, that is Chinedu Basi. Chinedu Basi is the program manager at CISLAC. Hi Tengi, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Nancy?
I'm fine. And Chinedu Basi, how are you?
I'm doing great.
All right. So we'll have Tengi go first. Tengi, could you give us an overview of Nigeria's energy transition and what would you say is your perception towards the transitioning, the need to transition, and how realistic is it basically for Nigeria to move from fossil fuel to green economy? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me, Nancy and Budget. The energy transition is not at all new. It's actually even predates the current conversations that we're having that have been precipitated by the climate crisis. Even before this, we've had different transitions. The general understanding of the transition, of an energy transition, is it as a switch from an economic system dependent on one or a series of different energy sources and technologies to another. The only difference that tends to occur over time is the type of energy being discussed or the type of energy being transitioned to. We've had technological advances and discoveries that have in the past precipitated these changes. We had in the 1850s, the coal transition, the 1920s, the oil transition, discovery of oil, 1950s, gas, hydro, and nuclear transition coming on stream. In the 1990s, due to decarbonization efforts, you've had solar and wind transitions. You've also had world events as well. So the climate crisis, where the Paris Agreement was then developed and agreed to by countries around the world in an effort to make sure that we avert the climate disaster and keep warming to about 1.5, not go beyond 1.5 Celsius. You've also had the 2022 Russian-Ukraine crisis conflicts, which also created another discussion around transitions and dependencies on certain energy sources. The perception around the transition in general is varied. There are different camps. There's the camp globally, which says that there's a climate crisis and we have to evolve quickly at a very fast pace to be able to ensure that by 2050, the world is able to meet its goal of achieving carbon neutrality, which is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and also reduce the effects around it, mitigate the effects and adapt to new energy sources. And in Africa, obviously there's a lot of the conversation is slightly different because the impacts likely to affect those in Africa, especially countries like Nigeria that are fossil fuel dependent, are quite concerning. There are revenue dependencies, energy dependencies, and there is a challenge economically as well. So when countries are trying to figure out how do we transition, how do we get the money, how do we get the technology, the transition then seems a bit daunting. And then there are perceptions around saying that Africa has only contributed 3% to that climate crisis, so we should not have to bear the brunt of having to transition. However, we have to think about the impacts of that transition. You have countries around the world transitioning to cleaner energy sources away from fossil fuels, which is the crux of the transition in this particular phase. and you have countries like Nigeria saying that's where most of our resources are coming from. So can we surely transition? But there's also another lens which says we depend on foreign exchange about 90%, but the markets that are responsible for buying our fossil fuels and giving us that foreign exchange is part of these countries that are trying to transition away to cleaner energy sources to meet commitments that have been made by them to avert this climate crisis. Nigeria will also be affected by, beyond this revenue challenge, which is around its foreign exchange earnings, which it relies on to pay its debt, would also relies on this fossil fuels again for its government revenues, to both at the state levels and also at the federal levels. And so if that revenue diminishes, what will Nigeria do? Those questions also arise. We also have seen increased flooding in Niger Delta, in Lagos, etc., and some due to poor governance potentially, and others due to potential climate change impacts. We also have migration in the north as well, but the question now goes, what happens when this actually becomes even worse due to climate change? So Nigeria stands to suffer both economic and environmental impacts and social impacts as well, because if Nigerians start to feel the pinch financially, feel the pinch in their environment, and all those other issues as well, they will likely react, and it may not be in positive ways. So all these different things have to be managed. So clearly for Nigeria, there is a case to address the transition, to engage the transition. The question then becomes, how will we do this? To what degree? And what resources do we need to engage it? And what is required in terms of collaboration regionally, globally, what opportunities exist, and how can Nigeria move forward?
Thank you for that detailed perception. Yeah, thank you so much for that. I would also want Chinedu to respond. Chinedu, if you don't mind, let's hear from you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Energy transition, Fengi had given a very elaborate background there. I don't know whether there is anything to add more, but just to say that it's a global issue. It's an inevitable issue right now, as we all know. What we should be talking about is fossil fuel dependent countries like Nigeria, who stand the risk of being on the receiving end of the effects of this energy transition, which is definitely happening, is to find a way to put on the table a plan, an achievable plan that has some level of step-by-step milestones, which is measurable towards transiting to the clean energy use, and how also we can garner the resources, because one major thing that has stood out from everything said is that it's quite resource intensive. How do we get that resources? And generally, how would our plan lead us to being on the good side of this inevitable event that is happening?
So now, Tengi mentioned that Nigeria will suffer economically, environmentally, even socially. But before we get to the effects, right, of this transition on Nigeria's economy, what do you think Nigeria requires to actually lead a successful transition? And apart from the effects, let's talk about the benefits of the transition for Nigeria.
Okay, thank you. For me right now, I would be saying that what we'll be looking at is potential benefits. We might not categorically say that we know those benefits that would be on ground. So potentially, we'll be looking at some aspect of the benefits, which for me, I would itemize things like a diversification of energy sources. We've known that one of the major challenges that we had with power in this dispensation that is fleeting away right now is the centrality of distribution and also generation, actually. So the potential will be that the government would put resources to harness some economically comparative renewable energy sources, which are domiciled in different areas of the country. We have some parts of the country that have more of sunlight. We have water. We have good sources of water that will help us generate more energy through hydro. We have some countries rich in some minerals that you can use to produce batteries. You have the gas down south. So those are potentially comparative resources which can be harnessed, and we have less of a centrality of energy sources. And of course, that would help to harness production wherever they are situated. Also, domestic uses would be harnessed. We might not have to, if planned very well, we might not have to see a situation where you need to transport a particular product from one extreme to another. So those are major benefits economically. We can also talk about jobs that will be created. You see that the renewable energy is a sector of itself, which has some level of value chain engagement. So people that are going to be working on manufacturing the batteries, the panels, in the case of wind. So technology will come into play. We'll have people that would have to go into manufacturing. It's a quite broad spectrum of space for most sectors to play in and utilize the potentials that it guarantees, puts on the table. And also in the supply aspect of it, like I said earlier, we're going to be seeing some level of harnessed energy supply, some level of stability. Of course, when we are talking about renewables, we are looking at resources that are in a long run sustainable. It's not depleting and would fade or just give way halfway somewhere there. Those are the potential economic benefits that I would be able to talk about right now.
You mentioned job creation for the nation to harness energy sources and some level of stability. I think you're not wrong in that aspect. Many people, particularly Nigerians, are looking forward to how this energy transition and the plan Nigeria has birthed for it will create as much job as possible and probably improve the unemployment rate in the country. Thank you so much for that, Chinedu. Now, let me also let Tengi react to the social and economic benefit. I mean, she mentioned that there's going to be some likely social, environmental, and economic effects. So if she can place the effect and the benefits, probably give us just a little bit of comparison. So Tengi, if you don't mind, just highlight some of those effects it will have, probably on the economy of citizens, and if you have, just share some benefits that Nigeria would also reap from this transition.
I like that framing of the question. I think it's actually a very good opportunity to sort of show the different sides of the risks and how potentially they can be managed by the opportunities that the transition actually presents. So one of the risks that I mentioned again was economic. So obviously, as fossil fuel dependent as Nigeria is, as the transition carries along and there's more shift, as I mentioned earlier on, to cleaner energies, Nigeria stands to lose potential revenues that it requires to run its economy. But on the flip side, the green economy also provides opportunities, as Chinedu has mentioned, in terms of jobs, in terms of energy access, domestically, and in terms of those opportunities as well. What Nigeria can stand to do is to ensure that it keys into the value chain of the opportunities that are presented by the green economy, and to be careful not to repeat examples or risks that we have experienced in the past in terms of Nigeria becoming a consumer of energy and not a producer. So again, Chinedu has mentioned things like the value chain, opportunities of creating batteries for storage, keying into solar, wind, hydro, all these different opportunities, but making sure that before that time comes on stream, at this transition, we're able to build in the skills that are required to get Nigerians to be able to practice in this space. A lot of more information out there, a lot of awareness in terms of the opportunities and what is required. There's an Energy Transition Plan that Nigeria launched in August, but obviously there's not enough awareness in terms of what that plan actually consists of and how private sector and citizens in general can key in to that plan. So as we started in our conversation around the national dialogue that we held on the 6th of October, obviously there are opportunities to create greater knowledge and greater understanding around what that might be. We've mentioned foreign exchange, again, that's a risk that Nigeria stands to lose. But with the transition again, if we are producers and not just consumers, we're able to export the different components that are required to service clean energy around the globe. So Nigeria has to position itself for that. There are different opportunities around gas as well, which Nedu has mentioned, but there are also challenges around likely stranded assets if we don't time that appropriately or work it appropriately in a way that benefits Nigeria. So what I mean by that is Nigeria has a lot of gas, but we haven't harnessed it effectively over the years, and we haven't built out the infrastructure that's required to extract and optimize those values. We have a lot of plans that we have looked at over the past number of years, but we cannot now decide to delve in and realize all of those things at once, because now there have to be trade-offs, because Nigeria's Energy Transition Plan itself seeks to, by 2030, optimize all its available benefits from gas up to 2030. A decade of gas plan also supports that intervention, so that has to be effectively managed. So the fact that Nigeria needs energy, I think, is the main crux of that issue. It's what kind of energy sources do we need? How can we make sure that whatever energy source we tap into, that it is something that is obviously renewable, unlike our fossil fuels, which has a shelf life. So it might be worth sort of seeing what the trade-offs are. How do we energize, and what's the best mix that Nigeria needs? So those are also the opportunities that the green economy and the renewables shift also provides for. Jobs, again, another risk is loss of jobs for the fossil fuel industry, shifting to the renewables industry. So that also has to be managed. We have to ensure that there's skills transfer. Those that can transition from fossil fuels to renewables are transitioned, that the opportunities are also created for Nigerians who potentially don't have jobs or who potentially can easily transit. So there are two lenses within that: is how do you address the job losses for those in fossil fuel industry and also those who are emerging from other sectors potentially. So it's a delicate balance that Nigeria has to manage. And also we have to look critically at the Energy Transition Plan that has been put forward to see whether it addresses all these different risks and manages different opportunities, and whether it provides timelines in terms of how all these things would work. Because it is essential that Nigerians are able to follow along, are also able to hold the government to account in terms of how it intends to manage these different transitions moving forward and addresses these risks, these transition risks that are emerging.
You mentioned that the government creating enough awareness around the energy transition where private sector can come in. join the plan, where citizens are coming to join the plan. Now, before I go over to the stakeholders actually responsible for the proper implementation of the plan and the transition, right? Let me hear your opinion. Now, you mentioned Nigeria should be not only consumers of the energy, but also producers. In that way, we are able to renew this energy that we're actually diversing into, and not fall into the mistakes of the fossil fuel that has a timeline that is limited. I mean, do you think we have the capacity to actually produce our own energy? Because truth be told, you're right when you say we need to make the energy renewable. So I think it's both you and Chinedu that want to react to this. Does Nigeria have the capacity? Do we have the resources to actually pull it through in a way that we are not just an energy consuming country, but we actually produce our own energy? In that way, we have a long-term value in this energy transition and the green economy markets.
I mean, that's the question. That's the main crux of this whole issue. Nigeria needs to transition, but how and can we? There is a huge financial aspect of this that Nigeria has to consider, as well as technology as well. The bill for the transition itself is $1.9 trillion to serve all that Nigeria has outlined in its energy transition plan that it needs to accomplish. $1.9 trillion, which is $400 million above business as usual, which essentially means we need to raise about $10 billion every year. And that's proven challenging in general. We haven't seen those sorts of earnings even for renewables and for other things over the last number of years. And as we say in Nigeria, our mainstay is oil at the moment, oil and then I suppose gas as well. But we haven't been able to reach our OPEC quota for a while. We have divesting IOCs and NOCs, so international oil companies, and then local or national oil companies taking over. But again, their capacity is obviously different. So that has likely contributed to this reduction in our production volumes, but also crude oil theft has also been attributed to that as well. So you have a situation where we're not earning enough, and money is a critical part of achieving this transition and being able to serve our own energy needs. But also we have to think about how are we going to now spend this money that we have. So because we have all these different challenges, we have to be very careful in the way we make decisions. So how are we spending the little money that we are able to earn to service our needs, but also prepare for this future so that we are not in the same predicament that we find ourselves in now. We need to make decisions that do not support waste and leakage of our funds. This subsidy bill that we have taken on might need to be reimagined from all subsidies, potentially maybe looking at how those funds could be diverted to renewables, because as we have explained and discussed in this conversation, when putting into cleaner energy sources is a renewable energy source that will serve us for long into the future, beyond these 2050 or 2025 or 2030, however we see it, the peak oil and gas, as has been estimated, depending on who you ask. And then even by 2050, where likely all the countries that Nigeria partners with as trade partners would have gone to cleaner energy sources. So we have to think very critically about how we're also going to raise that finance internationally, even for renewables as well, and the form that those financial instruments are going to take. Because we also want to make sure that we're not looking too much into getting more loans, because Nigeria has enough debts. We have to look about those potential instruments and negotiate in a way that benefits Nigeria in the long run. Also, we need to look at the mining sector. There hasn't been enough sort of critical evaluation of and work to ensure that the resources and the revenues that are gotten from mining in Nigeria translates into our economic development. We know that there's a lot more happening in that sector than is likely recorded. There are a lot of legacy issues in that sector already in terms of crisis, social crisis that we have in those areas, and different sort of conflicts that have originated from those areas already. If Nigeria decides that it needs to transition and needs to become a producer, it has to resolve all those issues to make sure that we're able to get the value that we need from that sector as well, because it's a lot of the conflicts that have happened in Niger Delta as well over the years that have also reduced the government take and the contribution that sector has been able to make to the Nigerian economy. So we need to resolve all those issues to make sure that the mining sector is able to work the way that it should. Technology is the other thing as well. We're delving a lot into solar in Nigeria. Wind, green hydrogen and everything else are coming at a slower pace. So we need to sort of find ways to engage and get a lot of technology transfers to make sure that we're able to get the solution that we need to be able to delve into all aspects of the value chain for the mineral sector. A lot of research and development is required to get this done. And private sector will carry the brunt likely of this, raising finances and contributing finances and technology, etc. So an enabling environment, policies, laws, regulations that can open up that space also is required, and not too heavy on government participation to some degree to make sure that it thrives, because we've seen a lot of cases where heavy government involvement has limited the capacity and the effectiveness of certain spaces. So these are all conditions that we need to think about now and implement fast to make sure that Nigeria is primed and positioned and ready to play that role of being more of a producer and less of a consumer, so that it doesn't repeat the same issues and the same mistakes that have been seen and observed in the fossil fuel industry, so that we can have a better future.
Thank you for that, Dengue. Thank you so much. So Chinedu, do you think Nigeria has the capacity to actually produce our own energy?
Yeah, my first response will be a yes. And how do I mean? Yes, in the sense that this is more of the adage that talks about a rain that was pre-announced. And my people said that it doesn't get the crippled outside. So because it's pre-announced, he starts his journey early enough to see how he can get to the next available shelter. Reference to the National Dialogue on Energy Transition, which was organized by NRGI and other partners. Lots of such is needed, not just to create awareness, but also to bring the issues that we already know, like Dengue had elaborately stated, on the table, and pick them one after the other to see where the risk lies and what potential mitigants can be put on the table. The resources are there. Some are in some fragile vessels now. So we're talking about the fossil fuel, the gas. How much time do we have to spend or to harness all the resources from that sector? How much prudence do we need in executing? How much speed do we need in putting things in place? Who have the residual knowledge already? We know that people have been into renewable energy for a long time, even in Nigeria here. How much are we tapping into the experiences that they have garnered over the years? What have been their pitfalls? What have been their successes? What have been the places that they could amplify the more? How much are we bringing everyone on the table to see how we can look at this risk? Of course, obvious ones that we already know, considering that this also would serve as a teaching period for the transition. So there will be space for for learning and relearning, unlearning, relearning, and learning new things while the time lasts. So that's why I also spoke about the speed and the time that we need, because if we go at a very slow pace, we might just end up waking up in 2049 and it becomes an emergency issue that we have to be running helter-skelter and be at the mercy of every other person. That would not mean that the resources were not there. So while financial resources is very important, I think that technical and human resources and knowledge itself will play a very, very important role in trying to see what can be put on the table, what are the low-cost spaces, which one are the cost-intensive spaces, how do we harness and channel such required resources to where it's supposed to be, and not spend it on something that didn't need it that much. What are we doing in the immediate? What will be deferred later on, maybe at a later date? What can wait and what cannot wait? So those are the things that I believe that that kind of dialogue that was done by NRGI would address if continued, or maybe for me to say that we need lots and lots of such convergence to serve as a foot stool to getting an achievable transition process towards clean energy.
Thank you so much. That would also bring me to the stakeholders responsible, the people that are actually responsible for the transition. Who are we supposed to hold on to? Who are we supposed to hold and demand accountability and responsibility from? So I want you to actually share your thoughts on that. What are the roles of state and non-state actors in transition? I also like the fact that you also mentioned that while the fiscal reality is actually key, it is not solely on financial resources as well. Both technical and human resources, knowledge, and hope is needed to actually pull off a successful transition. Thank you so much for that. So let's hear your thoughts. Who are the stakeholders responsible now to lead a very successful transition? Who are the people that are supposed to ask all of these questions that you've asked? So who are the people responsible for finding answers and lasting solutions to them?
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I also maybe mentioned them as well as I was speaking. But the central of it all is that there should be someone convening, and that will not stray very far away from the government itself, public sector, because these resources that we are talking about, whether it's from gas, whether it's from fossil fuel, or any other source, first of all, it's government. So they have the bigger pockets or the deeper pockets to be the rallying point for resources financially. The private sector would play a very important role in issues around financial resources, but more on the technical resources, bringing their expertise on ground. What has happened in the past? Are there some similar transitions or projects that have been of this magnitude? How was it surmounted, and what were the step-by-step processes that was followed? So they would do a very great deal in bringing the technical expertise on the table, while also bringing the financial resources where they can. The financial institutions will not be left out. Of course, a lot of issues around transactions and what that is feasible. When I mention them, I'm talking about carbon wastages. So most times we pay more attention on who brings. We pay more attention on revenue. We don't also pay attention on how to close the gaps that exist between revenue and spending. So if it's not about how much we have, but about how much we have was used. So the financial institutions would play a very important role. Maybe in this case, they will be put on the edge to make sure that they close the gaps for which we have had. We know that we have issues around illicit financial flows in Nigeria heavily. And if we don't also bring that as an aspect that we can look into in this case, hence we are talking about resources, then we might just as well be telling the old story, just like we have always known it around here. I think that the informal economy can also play an important role, because the statistics shows that about 85% of Nigerian workforce is in the informal economy. How can we bring them on board to see what low-hanging fruit is there for them to key into? And I'm also speaking all this based on past experience, and so today we are talking about artisanal miners or whatever. Some people call them illegal miners, some people call them artisanal miners. We talk about modular refineries, we talk about people who are burning things in the bush, and that is just a function of an unregulated or uncoordinated informal sector, who definitely you cannot remove in the whole picture. So can we start from this beginning to bring them into the workspace, to give them a clear picture of where they can play in and what resources and supports that they will need to be an asset, rather than being a loophole or a bottle, whichever one that they will choose to be within the process. We will not also do away with international influence on this. We know that we have so many interests from Western companies or international organizations who have serious stake on this. So how do we bring them on the table to ask them that question of what key role that they might be willing to play, so that we know what is on the table for us to plan with? A stitch in time, they say, saves 9. If we start on time, if we know, itemize these key stakeholders and who they are, what they are supposed to be doing at a particular time, and what time is needed, and how much resources that they will be needing or bringing, then we'll be able to have a good and smooth transition or process towards transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love where you brought in that quote, the stitch in time saves 9, actually. You also mentioned the speed. We start now, it's not when we get to 2059 or 2049, it becomes a thing of emergency, and before you know, we're not able to actually manage resources. And it does not matter what little funds we have, it's how effectively we're able to put that funds to good use. And like Nten said, no room for mismanagement or misappropriation. Thank you so much for that, Chinedu. So I'm going to let you guys go in a few minutes, but I would want you to leave your 2 cents. So I'm going to start with Tengi. So just recommendations, how the best you think the government should approach this transition. It's a good opportunity for Nigeria, no doubt. I mean, it's good. Funny enough, the era of fossil fuel is almost coming to an end, so we need to be prepared for the new energy, the new green economy. So, Tengi, what would you recommend for the government, for stakeholders? Where do you want citizens to come in? Just give us your 2 cents and
Okay, thank you for that. And thanks for breaking that down really well in terms of responsibilities of different actors, Chinedu. I will just add to that a bit, which also leads to or contributes to the resolutions and the recommendations that I'd also like to make. So right now, obviously, we have the Nigerian Energy Transition Office, and the Office of the Vice President, and the Federal Ministry of Environment, and also now the National Council on Climate Change. Those are all the high-level responsible parties for driving the energy transition and the implementation process. So that will give those who are listening an idea of who to hold accountable, at least for until this administration ends its task. Also, the Federal Ministry of Budget and National Planning as well, responsible for some of these things, and the Ministry of Petroleum Resources in terms of those gas ambitions that Nigeria wants to utilize with gas as a transition fuel, and the Ministry of Mines and Steel Development as well, which will be responsible for driving Nigeria's mining and production of this different metals, etc., and minerals that we need to engage transition and get value out of it. So that's just sort of a bit of a signpost in terms of who to hold responsible right now, but also tying to my recommendations as well of what we need to do is we need to make sure that as this government is also on its way out for next year, we have different campaigns ongoing. We hope, as we used to say in debates, hope we've been able to convince you and not confuse you of the need to transit, the Nigerian needs to transit, that those key risks that we have been itemized are also cascaded to these different aspirants to lead Nigeria, because they'll be largely responsible for the next leg of the implementation of the transition plan, or even just helping Nigeria to navigate what it can do moving forward after this administration leaves off. We also even have the COP27, which is happening in the next couple of weeks, second to third week, I believe, in November, where all of the things that we have discussed should also be cascaded and taken forward for those who will be attending, and the government also to try and negotiate a good standing for Nigeria, start to generate those revenues, generate those technological know-how, and be able to get support to upskill our human resources as well. And more specifically, and just sort of summing up part of what we've discussed, and connecting that to the national dialogue that we held on October 6th, and the communique that came out of that, which is available on the NRGI's website at resourcegovernance.org, on the Nigerian sort of page. Critical things within that communicate, but I'll only sort of highlight a number. One is key coordination. We need to make sure that everyone is talking to each other, so all the different government actors are collaborating effectively and doing their aspect and their part. And those what's required to be done is highlighted and codified into a monitoring evaluation framework that the non-state actors can assess and hold everyone accountable to as well, to make sure that we are doing and implementing the plan that we have and just engaging the process in a timely manner, which has come up at different times during this conversation. The time to act is now. Nigeria sometimes tends to be reactive instead of being responsive and being proactive. So we need to change that dynamic, because we cannot wake up at 2049, as we've said. At that point, it will be too late. So we need to take the opportunity that we have now and make sure that we key in and we move forward as quickly as possible. Just two more things I'd want to highlight. The enabling environment that is required to make sure that we streamline the plan that we have also with our development plans, because if we don't streamline it, then we are acting, we are not sort of bringing down to reality. And this will be a shiny plan that we have in one corner, but it would actually not be implemented. So the federal government and different government ministries will not understand what their responsibilities are. And those in the subnational government, so local states and local governments, will not understand what their roles are as well. And we need to make sure that we create an enabling environment for the private sector to actually key into this, and also Nigerians, because there is going to be a shift in the way in which Nigerians use energy as well, which we're not really taking cognizance of. So me in my home, if I'm using gas or if I'm using firewood or charcoal, I have to be willing to also change my energy source as well. So all of that needs to be considered in how we engage the energy transition plan, and also the implementation process, which is very key. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tengi. Everything actually comes to play. Engaging the process in a proactive manner and instead of waiting for a reactive manner, creating an enabling environment for it, streamlining development plan that Nigeria has. And you mentioned one very beautiful thing, the willingness of citizens actually accept the transition. You mentioned that someone that is already using someone on another source of energy willing to transition to that. Thank you so much. So Chinedu, let's have your 2 cents on the matter. What would you recommend the government to do, or what are they doing that could be better?
Thank you. If you permit me to bring in one important to me anyway, because it can also be relative. So in this whole process, Nigeria had announced gas as its transition fuel. So I don't want to go the lane of talking about this as a problem. I would bring it up to mean that the transition fuel should be tending towards generating the revenue needed for the transition, and not transition fuel for consumption per se. And why do I say that? We already have the infrastructure on ground to use it locally. If we have to use it as a transition fuel for consumption, that means we'll start building the infrastructure right now. We have all agreed that we don't have that resources to start building for a process that will still pass, and we start thinking about going to the real. So I think that we might have to look forward to how we transit once and not having 2 transitions in mind. That would be a waste of resources, and I think that we don't also have that much resources to put on ground. Like Tengi said, a lot have to be done. My call will be to everyone that's had one aspect of resources to bring on the table, civil society organizations, issues around awareness, to speak to who needs to hear, to bring these things down to earth, because when we are speaking in high-level languages, this is an issue that will definitely go down to the grassroots. Everybody is involved. Like Tengi rightly mentioned, it's going to affect from the elitist person to the rural person that cooks with firewood. How do they understand these issues? How do they relate with it? Do they even see themselves in it? Do they even understand what are the impact and implications in the long run? So that is one critical aspect that needs to be looked into, and I recommend more effort by all and sundry to make sure that we make the most of the time that we have right now. Else, we might be in a situation that is not good for an emergency anyway.
Thank you so much, Thank you so much, Tengi. That was an interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and Budget, for this opportunity. We look forward to more conversations and more opportunities to upscale and take this conversation forward on this issue that critically affects every single person in Nigeria at the moment. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity, and keep up good work. And we pray that every other organizations also keys into this to make the good news go around.
Thank you so much. Yes, the conversation continues on our social media platform. On Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, it's at Budget NG. Would love to hear your opinion. Keep it real, keep it coming. How realistic do you think Nigeria's energy transition plan is? It's Nancy, and I'll see you in the next episode.